search bar, chances are the first result you'll see is the United States, a nation that dominates the global stage. Did you know that nearly a quarter of the world's total GDP comes from the US? It's no wonder the US dollar rules global markets. And let's not forget its military strength, feared, respected, and often used as the benchmark for modern armed forces. But what makes it so extraordinary? How did a relatively young country rise so quickly to the top of the global power chain and become the center of the world's attention? The answer isn't simple. The United States has a long and complex history, but today, we're going to dig deep, piece by piece, to understand what truly shaped this global superpower. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller created a world map that featured the word America, referring to the continent in the Western Hemisphere. The name was derived from an Italian explorer and cartographer, Amerigo Vespucci. But long before that, the original inhabitants of the American continent had migrated from Asia, starting roughly between 40,000 and 12,000 years ago. They had already established colonies, developed advanced agricultural techniques, designed monumental architecture, and formed complex societies, some as structured as nations. One of the most prominent was the pre-Columbian Mississippian culture. Unfortunately, after European explorers and traders first made contact with Native Americans, millions of indigenous people died. Not just from conflict, but from diseases brought by the Europeans. Smallpox was one of the most devastating. Spanish explorers landed in La Florida in 1513 and later established settlements in what is now California and New Mexico. Eventually, they came into contact with the British colonies, most notably what became known as the 13 colonies in North America. These British settlements became a crucial foundation for the formation of the United States. Starting in 1607, British ships began arriving on the shores of Virginia. They established growing colonies, built settlements, slowly cleared forests, and claimed the land as their own. Not to be outdone, the Dutch founded New Netherland in the region we now know as New York, but Britain's ambitions were much greater. One by one, more British colonies sprang up along the East Coast, from Massachusetts to Georgia. In every new settlement, a pattern repeated. They exploited natural resources, seized land from Native Americans, and enslaved millions of Africans who were forcibly brought to the continent. However, during that time, the colonists living under British rule began to show signs of rebellion. They felt restricted and burdened by the British Crown's policies. These colonists had crossed the ocean in search of a new life, yet even in a new land, they found themselves struggling. Still forced to pay heavy taxes to a government an ocean away. Worse, they had no representation in the British Parliament. This sense of injustice fueled a growing desire for freedom. The flames of resistance were fanned by influential thinkers like John Locke and Thomas Paine, who gave intellectual strength to the revolution. Eventually, on July 4, 1776, the founding fathers of the United States declared independence by adopting the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson. After a long and grueling war, the American Revolution came to an end. A new nation was born, though its birth was far from perfect. In the records of world history, America's early years are stained with dark chapters. Aside from the painful legacy of slavery, it's important to understand that the new nation carried forward a familiar goal from its colonial roots: the expansion of its sovereignty. This ambition was later shaped into what became known as manifest destiny, the belief that God had blessed the United States and intended it to rule the entire North American continent. This belief dominated 19th century American policy and was used as justification to displace Native American tribes. Under the banner of manifest destiny, the U.S. expanded westward, seizing native lands and exploiting natural resources. But the expansion didn't stop there. The United States also began encroaching on the territory of other sovereign nations. One key example is Mexico. After gaining independence from Spain in 1810, Mexico held vast lands, especially in the north. Over time, American settlers poured into northern Mexico, outnumbering the Spanish-speaking population. This demographic shift fueled rebellion, most notably in Texas in 1835. The Texas Revolution led to its independence from Mexico. Just a decade later, the Republic of Texas voluntarily joined the United States. The conflict continued with a 6-year trade dispute between the United States and the European Union known as the Banana Wars, which lasted from 1899 to 1934. Then came the motive to conquer Spain, leading the U.S. to seize Spain's colonial territories in Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. This was soon followed by the annexation of Hawaii, Samoa, and several other regions. These actions quickly placed the United States at the center of global attention. When World War I broke out, the U.S. became increasingly involved in global politics. Its name began to be considered by other countries as a potential ally. This marked the end of its era of complete isolationism. At the time, President Woodrow Wilson took office and played a major role in forming the League of Nations, an initiative aimed at preventing another world war. Although his efforts ultimately failed as World War II still erupted and devastated Europe's economy, it unexpectedly opened a door for the United States to rise as a global superpower, at a time when the world had lost its former great powers. Geographically, the U.S. was fortunate. Its location kept it isolated from the epicenter of Europe's major conflicts, allowing it to remain relatively safe and to focus on internal development, boosting its economy, infrastructure, and military strength. In addition, the abundance of natural resources in the American continent was a huge advantage. Fertile lands, vast forests, and large mineral reserves provided a rock-solid foundation for its economic growth and government development. Moreover, the United States adopted a cooperative approach toward former Spanish colonies, forging economic ties that significantly boosted its national income, marking one of the most substantial economic growth periods in world history. The power and influence of the United States are also deeply rooted in its role as an architect of the global political and economic system. One of its defining traits is its frequent intervention in other countries, and world history has recorded numerous U.S. interventions that have shaped global stability. For example, the U.S. was involved in the Barbary Wars, which spanned from 1801 to 1815. During this conflict, the U.S. allied with the Kingdom of Sweden and the Kingdom of Sicily against the Barbary states of North Africa, including Morocco and parts of the Ottoman Empire. These interventions aimed to secure safe passage for American merchant ships sailing through those waters. Driven by similar trade interests, President Millard Fillmore later dispatched Commodore Matthew Perry on a diplomatic mission known as the Perry Expedition. From 1853 to 1854, Perry led a fleet of U.S. Navy warships to pressure Japan into ending its 220-year isolationist policy. This ultimately forced Japan to open its ports to American trade and begin diplomatic negotiations. Since the 17th century, the Japanese Empire had closed itself off from foreign influence to protect its sovereignty from the wave of colonialism spreading across the globe. The bold show of force by the U.S. during the Perry Expedition compelled Japan to reconnect with the outside world, an act that significantly benefited the U.S. by expanding its influence across Asia and the Pacific. Even before this, the U.S. had supported former Spanish colonies seeking independence, and its victory over Spain marked a turning point that helped dismantle the old European powers, pushing America onto the world stage as a rising global force. Despite its growing presence, America's dominance was truly recognized during and after World War I and II. These conflicts devastated the global economy and brought down great empires, such as the Ottoman Empire and the Qing dynasty of China. The U.S., however, remained largely unscathed thanks to its geographic location, separated from the conflict zones by vast oceans. When World War II erupted, the U.S. emerged even stronger. While much of Europe and Asia suffered massive destruction and infrastructure collapse, the United States leveraged the war to bolster its economy, expand its military reach, and eventually solidify its position as a global superpower. The downfall of Germany, the Soviet Union, and China during and after the war only strengthened America's global standing. Afterward, the United States, under the initiative of George Marshall, introduced the Marshall Plan, also known as the European Recovery Program, which offered economic aid to European countries. This assistance amounted to $13 billion at the time. The Marshall Plan was not only aimed at rebuilding the economies of Western and Southern Europe or creating political stability, but also at preventing the spread of communism and strengthening U.S. influence in the Western Bloc. While the plan was widely seen as a major humanitarian effort, on the other hand, the U.S. effectively made Western and Southern European countries heavily dependent on American support. Still, the United States had a powerful rival, the Soviet Union. The two powers engaged in a Cold War not through direct military confrontation but by competing for global influence, including by supporting coups, rebellions, dictatorships, and even proxy wars around the world. The Cold War intensified as both sides built military alliances, competed in developing cutting-edge technologies, and launched the space race. The Cold War came to an end when the Soviet Union collapsed on December 25, 1991, marking the moment when the U.S. emerged as the only superpower in modern history. America then established a global presence that remains largely unmatched. This was made possible by the U.S.'s early efforts to build a deeply rooted system of international influence, creating global institutions such as the United Nations, the UN Security Council, and international financial systems like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF. In terms of defense, the United States also held immense military power, particularly through its leadership in NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which included allies from Europe to Turkey. However, this dominance began to shift slightly during Donald Trump's presidency, as his more isolationist policies created openings for rising powers like China and Russia to expand their influence. aiming to challenge and potentially replace the US as the world's leading superpower. So far, the main contenders challenging the United States' dominance are China and Russia. However, many political analysts believe that the US will remain the world's sole superpower for several more decades, even as its rivals continue to expand their global influence. This view doesn't suggest that America is immune to decline or the loss of its superpower status, especially considering its ongoing domestic political divisions and recurring issues with corruption. Still, overall, the United States is seen as more likely to sustain and even strengthen its global standing. This perspective is supported by Professor Michael Beckley, a political science expert and author of the book Unrivaled: Why America Will Remain the World's Sole Superpower. When comparing the US to China, Beckley argues, yes, America's institutional systems may be messy, but China's are arguably worse. If the US is a flawed democracy, then China is a rigid oligarchy ruled by a dictator for life. In an interview published in Tax Notes, Beckley stated that China is the only country that comes close to matching the power and advantages of the United States when measured by national strength. But even then, China still falls short. America's wealth is nearly 3 times that of China, and its military power is roughly 5 times stronger. That gap can't be closed quickly. It would take decades for China to truly match the US. Even with all of America's current challenges, its long-term economic prospects remain stronger than any other nation's, making a steep decline highly unlikely. What about Russia then? Another historic rival with strengths in military technology, weapons, and strategic power. According to Beckley, although Russia emerged from the Soviet Union, once a formidable opponent of the United States, it still falls far short in terms of raw power. Russia's military budget is 10 times smaller than that of the US, and its economy is significantly weaker, reportedly even smaller than that of Texas, he says. Additionally, Beckley points out that Russia lacks strong allies capable of standing up to the United States and its NATO partners, the most powerful alliance in history. Some speculate that China and Russia might form a united front against the US, but this too seems highly improbable. Why? Because the two nations still dispute a 2,600-mile shared border and continue to compete for influence across Eurasia. They even sell weapons to each other's enemies. In his interview, Beckley warns that while a China-Russia alliance may not be solid, it should still be taken seriously. Both nations are aggressively pursuing the same goal: to undermine the United States and take its place as the world's dominant superpower. As the world's sole superpower, the United States enjoys privileges that no other nation can claim. It not only shapes the direction of global affairs at will, but can also wage war in any part of the world without ever fearing for its own safety. Its citizens sleep peacefully, untouched by the looming shadow of war on their doorstep. More remarkably, the US seems to operate with a kind of impunity. It can engage in the most controversial wars, trigger global economic crises, and still remain firmly seated as the most powerful country on Earth. America sets its own foreign policy agenda, free from the constraints or influence of others. While most countries are forced to confront problems within their own borders, the US has the luxury to choose which global issue it wants to face or ignore. American citizens also reap the benefits of their country's unmatched status. They travel the world freely, often using their own language and currency, and are welcomed in ways citizens of other nations are not. In fact, many countries have gone so far as to adopt American laws and regulations. As the center of the global economy, the US draws investment from every corner of the planet. Nations compete to maintain good relations with America, hoping to gain access to its markets and technology. As a result, the US lives in extraordinary wealth, continually attracting the brightest minds from around the world to build its future. But such power always comes with a price. Behind its triumph lies the shadow of potential abuse. American foreign policy, praised at home, has often sparked conflict and instability abroad. The consequences of these decisions may be invisible or irrelevant within the US. But smaller nations are the ones left to deal with the fallout. The weight of an empire is rarely felt by the empire itself,